between I Care If You Listen and American Composers Forum. And this was our way of starting the conversation of exploring cultural appropriation as it intersects with not only Western classical music, but also the broader cultural landscape. So the panelists that are here today are all authors who contributed essays to our Out of Context series. And today we'll be continuing the dialogue about cultural appropriation, talking about the essays that they wrote, and also providing ideas for next steps and how to carry this work forward. This series was commissioned by American Composers Forum, and now that I Care If You Listen is officially operating under American Composers Forum, we're excited that we're bringing this first project that we worked on collaboratively full circle. I just want to let everyone know that we will be recording today's session, not only for archival purposes, but we do also plan to share the video publicly once we have finished the recordings for the week. And we will have today a 60-minute discussion followed by a 15-minute Q&A period. So if you have questions throughout the discussion, feel free to drop them in the chat. We will be pulling all of the questions from the chat box. So if anything comes up, just let us know, and we'll be reminding you to submit your questions. So with that, I would just like to introduce our panel for today. So the authors that are joining us are Shruthi Rajasekar, the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker, Han-Ki Cheung, and Chevall Pryce. So I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Shruthi. Thank you, Shruthi.
Thank you, Amanda. I think I speak on behalf of all of the authors when I say how special and important it is that American Composers Forum and I Care If You Listen have created specific space for this conversation and have also made it such a priority with the series starting in January, and here we are in November. And not only, of course, having space for us to express our thoughts in these articles, but also to have this extremely important conversation now and to engage with all of you. So thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for coming with the attitude of wanting to learn, wanting to explore these issues more, willing to be vulnerable as we're all learning and trying to do better always. So we appreciate that you're bringing that attitude, and we look forward to the Q&A section. As Amanda said, please feel free to put your questions throughout the conversation in the chat, and we will address them in about 55 minutes. So each of us is going to introduce ourselves now and just give you a little bit of a summary of what each of our articles was about. So as Amanda said, my name is Shruthi Rajasekar. I'm a composer and vocalist. And my background is that I trained in Carnatic, South Indian classical music as a practitioner and continue to be practicing that art form, as well as Western classical music and now composing in the contemporary world. And I've engaged with people who are making programming decisions as a composer, but also as a student in Western classical ensembles and seeing how my teachers and my directors brought this music forward. So my article was both a reflection on how we program and how we address programming changes we want to make and do it with integrity, as well as potentially some resources and some steps forward. I'm next going to ask Han-Ki Cheung to introduce herself. She's the author of our second article, Modern Development of Non-Western Music.
Good afternoon to everyone. Right now I'm in Hong Kong, so right now it is 2 a.m. and I'm very lost in time. But I am a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota, studying music theory and minor in sociology. And I myself is I can consider myself as multi-instrumentalist. I started learning pipa, which is a Chinese instrument, but I have also been deeply entrenched in the Western musical training system. And the fact is, one of the things that I question a lot is about how we understand traditional music in a non-Western context, because for me, my experience with Chinese music is not traditional, and I can say that many of us who study Chinese music do not necessarily expose to the traditional culture in the way that many people assumed, because there's a lot of politics and culture involved in the whole construction of Chinese traditional music. And that is what my dissertation is about, is how composers basically, despite their claims of writing in traditional music, they are really not necessarily so, without knowing the whole becoming of what we now understand as traditional Chinese music. So a lot of what I wrote in this essay is actually my attempt to test water about how well my arguments are being perceived. So I'm very excited to be here and listen to all of your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Honky, and thank you for joining, especially, from the time zone that you're in. If you missed that, she said it's 2 a.m. for her right now. So this is how important she believes the conversation is, that she's, frequently coming in the middle of the night to discuss these issues. So thank you so much. I'll now invite Chevall Pryce, who's the author of our fourth article, The Muddy Ownership of Dreadlocks. Thank you, Chevall, for joining us today.
Yeah, no, of course. Hi, my name is Chevall Pryce. I am a reporter in the Houston area in Texas, and I'm also a freelance writer that focuses on culture, music, more recently video games, kind of cover everything. But what my article about the muddy ownership of dreadlocks was actually written, started to get written when I first got my own dreadlocks. And it really was about the history of the concept and how that concept has kind of, moved us to where we are today. So, a lot of people, pretty much people of all races get dreadlocks, which, at its base, there's no problem with that. It's just that there's a history and context for, different communities, different social aspects for who has what type of hair. So that's really what I was exploring is, as the title, suggests, who does the, hairstyle dreadlocks belong to? And how do we even really get to this point? And, I went into it, being like, no, I mean, I don't understand non-white people having dreadlocks. This, is offensive to me. And, as I kept, learning and kind of, going into the process of even just small things like how hair works and how the hair, binds together and really, becomes these long tendrils on people's heads, it kind of, enlightened me to, Indian cultures way back in the day having dreadlocks, and Viking cultures, that was just an easier thing for them to do. So really the article helped me kind of realize, how a lot of cultural impacts can, make something the focal point of something for one type of person. So for instance, as an American Black person, dreadlocks mean something completely different to me than somebody in Australia or Europe or something like that. So yeah, that's really what it goes into, is just, how does this touch upon, the context of not only just the hairstyle, but, who is perceived when wearing that hairstyle and how it affects their life.
Thank you, Chevall. Thank you so much for being here in this conversation. And thank you for being so generous with the way you shared your journey in this article. I think for anyone who's read it, you've really shared the entire personal experience, and looking forward to discussing that further with you. And finally, I'm going to call upon the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker to introduce herself and her amazing article.
Hello, I'm the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker. I'm a new Renaissance artist, which is a term I created. So the working definition changes on any given day, which I will talk more about that. So I don't want to give away the whole cow, so to speak. And my article was really inspired by a lot of white dudes who often talk about reverse racism, reverse cultural appropriation, and particularly focused on the mixing of races by oppressors, looking at Black bodies as property. And so the rich history, and there are going to be some trigger warnings on rape here, the rich history of the South in particular, but also other cultures where white people came in either as missionaries or colonists and raped the women, and those women then had children of the colonists and or missionaries. And so embedded in all Black people is some history of a white ancestor for the most part, and how we have access to the language of our oppressors through that lineage, but also through the fact that we've had to put on a coat in order to survive oppression. And so within that coat, it became molded to us. And so this understanding of, primarily white ways of communicating became a part of who we are as African Americans today. There's more, but that's generally what you need to know.
Great starting place. And let's actually start with you. So in the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker's article, what I love about it so much is that you so clearly, for everyone, it's one of the big takeaways from this series, you explain that cultural appropriation is not something that's a two-way street. It doesn't happen in both directions. It actually can't happen in both directions. And this is because of the colonial legacies of power that we still experience today. So there is an oppressor and there is an oppressed. And even as our world becomes increasingly globalized and people want to make conversations about other actions and other kinds of claiming of music, there's only one kind of appropriation, as you so clearly express. To take this a little bit further, I was wondering if we could indeed dive into your label of New Renaissance artist, how you identify with that, how you came to that. And I also wanted to pose a hypothetical situation to you, because I think in a lot of ways, people can understand why cultural appropriation does not happen in both directions if they think in terms of the past and actions that have happened in history and such. But the point of this is a present, ongoing conversation, ongoing occurrence. So the hypothetical I wanted to ask you is if a student who let's say they greatly admire your work, and they want to say that in the style of the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker, I am a New Renaissance artist, if they wanted to put that out there, could you explain to us why that would be problematic?
There's two reasons as to why it's one, it's problematic because, I'll go into the origin of New Renaissance after that. But it is a term that I've created for myself. And in itself, it is an artistic creation. To name myself a New Renaissance artist and to refuse specific labels that put me in a bunch of different boxes it's a revolutionary act for a Black woman in America. And that's one part of it. But the other part is that it's actually an act of artistic creation, expression, and identity. So now if you're trying to take that, and then there's also the marketing aspect of it, that I've now been a New Renaissance artist for so long that New Renaissance artist is now synonymous with Elizabeth A. Baker. So if you were to call someone that, it now creates this linkage that isn't necessarily the truth. The second part of it is that if a bunch of students started saying that they were in the style of Elizabeth A. Baker, which part of New Renaissance is a constant rebirth, so I don't know if there's like an actual style, but it would create this weird school of thought. And I don't ever want to be in charge of a school of thought of other humans. That feels like a lot of responsibility. I don't even think there's an insurance policy to cover me for that. So I would just categorically reject that. The origin of the title New Renaissance there's actually a blog post about this on my website, but I was involved with dance films several years ago, and one of the directors for a dance film that I was working on introduced me to someone as the composer of the film. And I immediately felt like a physical box and like a restriction on my being. And I was like, okay, cool, I can't be a composer. There's something that I just don't feel that title represents who I am. And that's because I do so many different things. And so around that same time, people were like, oh, well, you're a toy pianist / electronic artist / audio engineer / author. And there were too many slashes. And I was like, you can't just say I'm a composer, because that rejects every other part of who I am as a human that creates. But then, I happened upon on Facebook an interview of Laurie Anderson, who talked about the biggest mistake that young artists make is putting themselves into a box because of the need for marketing that they can't break free of later on in their career. So you have to have a title. where he talks about you have to have a title of some sort so that they can figure out how to describe you in the press. But you have to have ownership of your title. By having ownership and renaming yourself, you're able to control the narrative, and you're able to create a more complete view of who you are. And just from a basic artistic standpoint, you know, I mean, in pandemic times, I've done a ton of sound films, which, you know, I didn't necessarily do pre-pandemic. Well, if I was a composer, it wouldn't make sense for me to be like, hey, I'm dancing. I have a movement background. By the way, nobody knew that. But I'm dancing on film in the woods. Also, I'm like making music with the natural sonicscape. Like that doesn't make sense if you're just in the box of expectations that humans have for you. And then the social justice aspect of it is that I constantly feel the need to change our language on how we address humans and their possibilities. So I'm the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker instead of Miss Baker because, you know, white feminism stole the definition of what a woman is. So now I'm the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker. And in that act, it's both an artistic and social justice act to reclaim my identity, but also open up discussion for others so that we stop living in boxes.
Very well put, and also very, very inspiring, I can say personally, to hear that. Thank you. Honky, I wanted to ask you about your article, which is super fascinating for anyone to read, especially as a traditional practitioner, though it sparked a lot of ideas and questions for me. So thank you for pushing me also. So something that you explain also very clearly in your article is that from sort of the Western gaze, we allow Western art, Western music to develop, and we recognize it as having, say, different periods. You're taught that in education. You also have people challenging those periods, but you have discussion of people reforming it, and there's this acknowledgement that it's constantly changing, and it's, you know, people who are creating contemporary are allowed to change. That recognition isn't given to traditional music as you show it, to non-Western music. And certainly from the Western perspective, I think you make it quite clear that it's because it's viewed as sort of an exoticized thing that it's sort of required to stay frozen in time and to just always be this ancient traditional art form. But you also make it clear that for certain practitioners, they also view it that way, and they view it as unchanging. So you give some really radical ideas of how we can think about the contemporary developments of these art forms. And I really appreciated all your suggestions. Something I was wondering, however, is at what point do you think that knowledge formation needs to be challenged? So in other words, how do we become a critical practitioner? Is there some value in practitioners, traditional practitioners, maybe not questioning it right away, later in the process? Is it different if someone's learning, if they're not from that culture and they want to take on a critical perspective versus they're from the culture and they want to have a critical perspective? Does the political scenario that it's in make a difference? So just some of the many things I'm wondering.
Wow, that's a loaded one. And honestly, I really don't have an answer to that. I'm just going to throw it out here. But I can tell you maybe 3 personal vignettes and kind of show how I'm thinking about this. My own personal reckoning that the traditional Chinese music I've been exposed to is questionable. When I started to notice that when I was 14, 15, after learning the instrument for 6 to 7 years, when I'm proficient enough. And at the same time, to be honest, it is because I also was studying Western music analysis. And I started to realize something is strange in the repertoire that I'm playing. I was also getting really interested in music history at that point and was like, hold on a minute, why everything is written in the 50s and 60s? Something is strange in the lineage of music that I'm learning. And I had the conversation with my people teacher then. It's like, oh yeah, there are things that in the anthology that I'm studying from is totally excluded, like Asians or actual, like, this is the very confusing term in the anthology. They would say traditional Asian pieces, whatever that means. Like, they just don't even trace the lineage of those older pieces. While for pieces that are written in the 50s and 60s, they would not tell you when it's being composed. So like that way of presenting the anthology, that way of presenting music in a way that is a historical, atemporal, is questionable. Like, if you're someone who is able to read, who knows how to count numbers, perhaps you should start asking, like, when is it being composed? What is happening then? For someone who's at junior high or even middle school, they can understand something about history. Whether they can critically think about it, I don't think that matters at that point. So that's my own understanding. Do I see some of my colleagues who is now professionals in Chinese music ever think about those things? They don't necessarily. Some of them just, none of my business. I'm just playing my instrument. And I think a lot of the practitioners in music would say, I'm just here to play my instrument. Don't tell me about politics. I don't care. They are doing just fine. But perhaps there are questionable practices that requires people who are willing to think one step further to really deconstruct it. And I think that's why we are here and asking these hard questions. And then, well, probably just one more vignette, and that is my experience in teaching during my master's in the Chinese ensemble. And I was teaching adults who are Caucasians, and they want to learn pluck string instruments. And when I introduced the instrument, when they have not even learned how to play it, or they don't even know what it sounds like, I start talking about the politics from day one. Look at the way that the frets are being arranged. It is a chromatic scale. It is not anything that is the same even 30 years ago on the instrument. There's a lot of expansion in technology that happened because the instrument itself is trying to be conforming to a more symphonic sound, a more homogeneous texture in order to create a symphony orchestra in the Chinese style. Is that a tradition? Is that innovation? Or is it something that is totally appropriating what Chinese music is? I don't even know how to understand that. Or what is there a right answer to that? I really don't. There was a huge debate about this particular question about Chinese orchestra in the 90s and totally disappeared now. But for me, whenever I teach a piece, I really care about having the students know, particularly for adults, particularly for people who are interested in Chinese music as a foreigner, to know the cultural and political backgrounds behind that, because they are not atemporal. They are all constructed. And for me, I think one thing that really stood out to me, or that's kind of my bias, is that I believe a lot of the non-Western traditions that we are understanding now are at one point nationalist constructs to claim a particular ethnic identity. So, and during the process of creating the tradition, there are a lot of selection and or appropriation that have happened, not just by Westerners, but also by the people who are part of the power holders of a nation building project. So that's my 2%.
Super insightful and some great ideas that you're adding to what we just had spoken about, how this appropriation happens. Is that, you know, many times in power structures, we've seen this in other contexts, there are people who sort of enable it to happen too. And so what is their responsibility? What do they hold? At the same time, I would point to something that the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker puts in her article for reasons why a Black artist might use white culture. She talks about assimilation as an act of survival. And so that's also to be considered in this context too, that sometimes you were forced to take this on, you were required to take this on. But super interesting to consider that even the geography of the instrument, the physicality of the instrument's been shaped by more modern history, and something that certainly needs to be addressed by those of us who at least have an interest in talking about it. We should make sure we make space for that conversation. Chevall, I wanted to switch gears a little bit and turn to your article. It's, like I said, super generous of you to share so much of this journey with us. And thank you for giving us the privilege of sort of being a witness to that. I think something that's really excellent about your article is that it makes one of the many parts of this discussion extremely clear, It's in one of your sentences. I'm just going to quote it, but you talk about style versus symbolism. And the quote is, "Black dreadlocks have become a hybrid of political statement and fashionable hairstyle, with rappers and pro-Black activists getting dreaded. While non-Black connections to dreadlocks in 2020 are more stylistic than symbolic." So there's a certain privilege, right, in the choice of it just being one of style, and you relate an anecdote of a friend with that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So that's kind of, you know, listening to everybody else talk, it really reminded me that, you know, a lot of us have very similar experiences, just in very different situations and different, you know, forms of media and, you know, just life in general. But yeah, so what I meant when I was saying that it's more stylistic than symbolic for other people, I mean, you know, before I even got my dreadlocks, I was always judged for my hair. I used to have an afro, you know, Black people have nappy hair. It happens. It's not something we're supposed to look down on or something we're supposed to judge each other for. And, you know, the thing is that when I take on that hairstyle, or when I don that hairstyle, I don't have a choice in that, right? There's nothing that when I do that, it's like, okay, well, I can just take this off anytime. My hair is going to be my hair no matter what. So the problem with non-Black people, or, you know, specifically American non-Black people, because we have a very specific context, especially in our nation with it, is that, you know, they are shed of a lot of those consequences. For instance, in the article, I talked about a book I read called Twisted, about another man's journey through having dreadlocks. And he mentions, you know, in the 90s and in earlier decades, I mean, heck, even now, a lot of villains, a lot of, you know, people who were supposed to be, you know, drug dealers or gangsters and stuff like that all had dreadlocks. And they were usually Black men, or they had, you know, crazy, you know, bad Caribbean accents, which, you know, as somebody with Jamaican heritage, it was also very, you know, jarring to see stuff like that. And, you know, so to get really to the question of what is the difference between being ignorant and being, you know, aware, but choosing to go forward with it, is that both are harmful, but one is, you know, there's actually a chance for people to educate themselves. There's a difference between, you know, moving forward with something and thinking that, you know, oh, dreadlocks are cool. I want to have this hairstyle. I mean, we see a lot of that happening in some of my friends, their favorite genre of music is K-pop, and Korean, you know, pop music. They probably steal so much from rap music very consistently. And, you know, there's a different cultural context for that, though. So
may I interject there?
Yeah, no problem.
A lot of the producers are Americans, so.
That makes sense, though. Okay, so they're just slapping that crap everywhere. So really, you know, a lot of the difference between those two things is that there's a difference between, like, a kid wanting to get dreadlocks, not knowing things, and then using a recent example, calling something the Million MAGA March and knowing what you're doing when you're doing that. You know, it's kind of, in a way, saying, hey, I want that, let me take it, and I'll make it mine, and I'll make it positive. And that kind of erases, you know, what Black people had to get through to where we're seeing now, a lot of us wanting more natural hairstyles, a lot of us showing our natural hair, a lot of us, you know, really getting away from relaxers and things of that sort, is because, you know, that was a Eurocentric way of stylizing our hair that was, you know, given to us. And even to this day, there are arguments within our community. Like, there's so much loaded discussion behind even just our hair that sometimes when people step into that space and they're like, oh, well, I want to do that, it feels disrespectful. And, you know, part of that conversation is bringing people to the center and being like, okay, so you want to have dreadlocks, do you understand, you know, kind of what this means, how this will affect your hair first and foremost? Because I feel like some people don't know, you know, the long-term damage it can have to your hair if you don't do it correctly. And, you know, really what other people went through to get to this point of their lives, you know, because as any other Black person, or, you know, person with Black heritage knows, you know, your hair is a very important thing that's probably going to follow you around for a while. It's something that you constantly have to style. You're constantly looking after it. So really, there is no worse. It just, you know, it depends, you know, who are you speaking to? Is this somebody who said, yeah, I know that dreadlocks are this or that, but I just want to do it? Versus someone who, you know, maybe they just really like rap music. Maybe their favorite rapper has dreadlocks and they're not Black, but they thought, you know, maybe I could do this. And really what it comes down to is helping people get to that point to where they don't need a Black person to come right up to them and say, hey, don't do this. A lot of the times it really is about, you know, self-education and really letting a lot of people know, you know, why does the context change? Because the context for dreadlocks has changed multiple times over multiple generations through different cultures and everything. So, that's why it depends if, who you're speaking with, really what you're trying to get to the bottom of, is this something that that this is mine, and you are kind of dealing with the whole melting pot concept where no races are different and we can all just get along and take things from each other? Or are we going to put the context in it? And maybe you could have that second thought, think, how does this take away from, the wider aspect of that culture and everything? Because I don't have a problem with, just the visibility of dreadlocks on other people. It's really just whether or not, that person knows how, that affects that community. I wouldn't do it personally, but, it's always good to just know who you're talking to and know why these things are important to these cultures. Because it's like, the reverse appropriation thing, which doesn't exist. It's like that, like there will never be a time when I can go get a buzz cut or cut my hair down or get a naturally, European hairstyle, and it would be taking away from that hairstyle. There are power dynamics in play. It's an entirely different concept.
I wanted to just quickly add something to your things, as a Black woman who has had many a relaxer in my life.
Yeah.
For the non-Black folk in our audience to understand that a relaxer is incredibly volatile chemical process, and I have had burns. You get chemical burns. So the choice to go to natural hair is often sometimes a health choice, because those are chemicals that should actually not ever go on a human. They can burn through skin. So, so just to put that into extra context for your conversation, because, us trying to reclaim natural hair is also just wanting to be healthy and not be oppressed every day with, painful sores on your scalp. Just
of course. No, for sure. And, those relaxers have also been shown to have, long-term effects on health. Like it is actually like, I mean, it's one of those things where the more you look into it, the more dangerous it becomes, because yes, all women, use hair products, men use hair products, non-binary people use hair products. But the thing is that you have to recognize that specific communities have had an idea kind of overshadowing their lives of, hey, I need to fit in with this. And as a result, we have decades and decades and decades of people with chemical burns on their heads. And, yes, you can argue that it was a choice, but it's steeped in a lot of different history and everything.
Absolutely. Thank you, both of you, for shedding more light on that and for really helping us understand the violence that's been done with these kinds of tropes expected of people. And that, I think, gets another point that Chevall was discussing, which is this idea of self-education and taking up space. So after reading your article, Chevall, I decided to brave the Reddit thread that you talked about, as well as did some YouTube, Googling for some of the channels that you'd mentioned. And I think I was not expecting, I mean, you described it in your article, but I really wasn't expecting how much it would be flooded by non-Black people taking up the space. Like, it was actually so hard for me to find a YouTube channel that was with someone who was Black, because so many had, I mean, if I was just Googling it, I was just finding, scores and scores of videos of people, again, taking up that space. So I think what you're saying about that self-education process, I'm hoping we're going to be, every step of, every panel like this gets us closer and closer to that. But I think it's important for people who've never had to think about taking up space to make that, a part of their process now, because I think I can say with confidence that all of us in the panel today have had that process of thinking, probably every second that we operate in sort of quote unquote mainstream spaces where in fact the default thinking is one of whiteness, that we are thinking about how much space we're taking up and potentially being told that we're taking up too much space just by existing. So for everyone to have that process of thinking of how much space they take up is a powerful one for sure. And I think that gets to one of the questions I wanted to broadly ask all of you, which is, we talk about decentering whiteness. It's a key part of the conversation of this particular series too. And Corey Hill's amazing article, who's the moderator for Thursday's panel, she sums up all of her articles and talks about this, the call of action of decentering. But what does that look like? Because none of us have ever lived in a world where it hasn't been decentered. So do you have any ideas of the kind of space you're envisioning, small or large, of what it means to decenter whiteness? I mean, for me, I think it starts with this taking up space question.
Yeah.
I think that in the taking up space, we also have to address the fact that, you know, anyone who comes from a heritage that is not white has been given lies their entire life of this inferiority, that we are racially inferior. So even if we are the most empowered people, we have to cast off those ideas, which are deeply embedded into the hierarchy of how society works. So we can have ideas, but there also has to be an inward change, because, for instance, you know, within the Black culture, you know, there are certain things, like we were just talking about with hair, where it's so ingrained because, you know, you're told as a child, like, oh, if you don't get a relaxer, you will never get a job because you're not going to be appropriate for the workplace, doesn't look professional. So until we can dismantle some of those things, it's going to be quite difficult on a mass level to really enact those decentralized changes. And it comes within educating the community, seeking to be more seen, as well as, you know, the white folks who also need to be educated to step out of the way and give the space.
Yeah, I would like to chime in a little bit, and coming from a slightly different positionality. And here is where the discussion of race becomes so challenging, because it is not just about white versus Black. There's some people in between, which is basically Shruthi and me. And I think a lot of us who are slightly aware of the racial discourse will have heard of modern minority, which is basically, to some degree, Latinos, but mostly the East Asians and Indians, who are like, oh, they are basically, there's no such thing as glass ceiling. They are just living a very, like, a lot of them are living in suburbs. They are having a very good life. What are you talking about? Race is not a thing. And modern minority is very often the thing to prove that race is no longer a problem, which is not true in a lot of ways. First, yeah, there are a lot of suburbians that are people of color, but they are living in suburbs that are actually congregating with people of color, and white people are actually going to other parts of the suburbs, things like that. So, and the glass ceilings is actually still very, very much present. And as someone who is in the music academia, I can say I am struggling to have my point of view even noticed, simply because I'm taking a almost cynical to some degree every now and then about how we understand non-white culture. I kind of go a little bit too far from there and forget what I was going to say, but I think it's also to some degree responding to what I'm seeing in chat. Yeah, I would say not only it is not necessarily true that we need white people to tell the untold stories, but at the same time, we have to be really careful for the non-white people to be aware of their white tendencies, if you will, because we are so ingrained in this racialized society where we're being taught about the white ideology. Like, that is the way, like, think about academic English, as simple as that. Like, there's a particular way for us to articulate ourselves that is accepted. But why? Like, that is one of the questions, like, how can we decentralize as simple as our language usage, as simple as our presentations of self? Like, can we be seen as equal when we look different? It's a very big question.
Very well said. I think, Chevall, you had something to say as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, to answer your original question, like, just to the point before I go rambling, it would definitely be, it would have to start on a smaller scale, just like the Honorable Elizabeth Baker said. it would have to start at that level, because I mean, let's be real, there are books right now, there are lectures you can watch, there are people you can talk to, but sadly not everybody, even if they have the access to those things, is going to go looking for it. They're not going to read it. You can put, you know, the new Jim Crow in front of somebody's face 50 times and it doesn't matter. They may not read it until, you know, you pry their eyes open like Clockwork Orange or something. So really, you know, there's a couple things that need to happen in these spaces where we do begin discussing this. And we do need to get away from this vision of white saviorism. In the chat, there's something, you guys can see the chat, and in the chat, you know, there was a question asked about, you know, so what if a white person wanted to tell a story and no minority was available to tell it? That is actually impossible. We exist, we are out there, you can find somebody. There is no single situation where you need to go to somebody of a different culture to learn about that culture instead, because we're extinct. We are not currently extinct, we are there. So
Very well said.
a lot of what happens in these conversations is that people get caught up in respectability politics, and it's also, it gets very, you know, me centered for a lot of people. Because what I found, and you know, actually my girlfriend's white and she understands a lot of the power dynamics and we talk about it, but when we talk to other white people and just non-Black people who don't know, you know, a lot of history, and Black people who don't know a lot of history, you do find a lot of, you know, white centric ideas like, oh, well, these people commit crime because of bad parenting, or, you know, these people, or like the model minority thing. Like that's basically just a way of almost ignoring entire types of people, because it's like, oh, okay, they're fine. They live in nice suburbs, but like you said, you know, where there's white flight happening in those same suburbs. So, you know, it really comes down to people wanting to listen and really like accepting it. And somebody asked in the chat as well, you know, how long does that change take? We're always going through incremental changes, but it's always about not taking that step back. It's always about keeping the forward momentum, like including everyone, understanding that, yes, you know, we all have different perspectives, but there's not one that overrules the rest of them. I mean, we need to unlearn a lot of lies that have been taught in history. We need to unlearn a lot of, you know, falsities that are being told about communities. I mean, I still get in arguments to this day about, you know, poverty in Black communities and how it really boils down to parenting. And that is blatantly racist. I don't know how else to say that. So really, you know, it has to happen in neutral spaces. And a lot of people I've noticed, it has to be somebody that they care about, or somebody that they know who is speaking with them. And I hate that, because I don't want it to come back around to, you know, it's our job to go serve everybody, because it's not. It really is about smaller communities coming together, not just that Black guy or just that Asian guy in the community to teach everybody. It kind of starts with, you know, a meeting point in the middle.
And also, to jump off of that, I mean, we didn't talk about it earlier in my introduction, but I do work as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant for many different groups of people. And so these are things that we discuss in our meetings. One of the biggest things I have to say is that, you know, after everything happened in June with Floyd and all of that, so that situation, everyone had a book club. That was the first thing. Like, we're all gonna have a book club. And I tell people all the time is like, you can say that you are engaging in anti-racist practices and that you're going to do these, you know, you're going to have these lofty goals, but it's like telling someone that you love them. Unless you have actual tangible action behind it, those words are as meaningless as a bumper sticker that says give peace a chance. Like, it doesn't mean anything unless you put the action into it. And so what I see now is we're at a point where tangible action has to take charge. And I, you know, before our call, I was talking about the deaccession of white people in nonprofit, like, high positions. You have wonderful white women who are very caring, nice people, enjoy them. But until you have a person of color, it doesn't necessarily have to be a Black person, but it has to be a person who is not, you know, centered in white narrative. Until they are in charge of organizations, you can make changes, but you're never going to get to the 180 pivot to equity and inclusion that's going to happen from having a leader who has a different perspective on America and how and what the community needs.
May I also add into that, because that is a fantastic point. And here I would like to just have a little hint of another project I'm working on, which is I'm doing a research about orchestras, and I have been talking to orchestra leaders throughout the summer and speaking about diversity discourse and how can we make this place or this field more equitable. And that is one thing that really is very fascinating. I'm just going to very approximately talk about the numbers. I have less than 5 people of color within the whole around 30 something people of the people that I've interviewed. I tried to email every single people of color in order to join this conversation in my research project. And I can tell you, even so, there are less than 10 in total. And I got less than 5 of them, which is still like, it was a reasonable percentage, but compared with the 200 something white people that I can choose for talking with me, like it was so much harder. So first of all, there was already like this power imbalance between white and people of color first. Secondly, when I like one of the main goal of the research is how do they think about diversity as a word. I do not tell them what does it mean to be diverse, what does it mean to be equitable. I don't say anything. And I can tell you more than half of the times when I use the word diversity, and the thing that they think is, oh, we have Asian, we have Latino in the orchestra, we have Black person, great, we are diverse. Well, like what the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker said, that is not changing the power dynamic. That's not changing the structure. White people is still the dominant leadership, and there's like still the culture hasn't changed simply because you fill in the number, the quota of people of color.
Very well said. And I think, Hanki, your point speaks to a lot of the research going on in diversity discourse, which I know you work in, which is, just to sum it up for everyone in the room, diversity measures that, that rhetoric was, I think sociologists trace it to about the 80s that it was introduced. And indeed, when it came about, it had, some significant impact when it came to certain measures. But actually, what scholars say today is that diversity discourse has allowed organizations to couch their continuing racism by pointing to, well, we have XYZ person, and instead of achieving actually equitable practices, and like we're talking about significant changes in leadership, it's actually become a more pernicious thing that's allowed them to continue operating and essentially not changing much of what they do, just sort of repackaging it, as it were. So, I mean, to make bold changes, we need bold solutions. And I'm going to continue off of the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker's point and talk about deaccession in the context of the museum and art world. So this is when organizations remove items from their collections. We've heard a lot about this in the pandemic in terms of the economic conditions of that, but I'm more thinking about the fact that they potentially decide to not show a work and no longer have that work in their collection. And I've been thinking about how we can bring that into music, and something that's on my mind is, why do we program certain works anymore? Certain works that are problematic, certain works that are speaking of violence against individuals. I know for myself, when I've witnessed those works that I have that sort of reaction to, it's not a thought-provoking experience, it's a traumatic experience, and it's only thought-provoking if it has nothing to do with you. And so one solution I've seen in sort of my personal work world is that what they'll do is they'll program that, usually it's an older work also, it happens to be, they'll program that older work, and then they'll program or commission a newer work that responds to it right after, as if that can negate the damage done. But I return to the same question, why are we programming this work? That's one solution that I see as a way of moving forward.
I think we also have to have discussions about how things are programmed. We tend to, at least, in America, and I can't speak for other countries, there's the presentation of a work, Sometimes there's program notes, usually written by the composer, exploiting the power dynamics of, because I'm the creator, I am the god of how this piece is received. And we've lost this historical practice of presenting work and having discussions around it within a social context. And so, you know, there are some works where, just like history, we should know that they exist and understand what went wrong so that we don't, you know, commit those atrocities of the past. But you can't have that conversation if you're not having conversations in join with the presentation of work. And so especially, I mean, this was happening, you know, in live performance, but especially now that we have these live stream situations and you have chats, I mean, it should be super easy, since people don't have to worry about driving home or anything, to include a Q&A, or at least a roundtable discussion with the people putting on the work, perhaps the performers, and if there are, you know, living composers available, they should be involved in a discussion that is an equal exchange between them and the participants who were there to listen or otherwise engage with those works. It's so important, and we're just not doing it.
Very well said. I'm thinking about resources moving forward, and the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker, you've suggested quite a few, but one thing we'd also discussed earlier was the term crate digging. If you could explain that a little bit for the audience and what you mean by that.
So crate digging is a term that popped up a lot in hip hop in the early years, where you had to actually physically dig into record store crates to find those samples that, you know, you could then string together to make an incredibly impressive piece. DJs also did it, and I look at the search for new people to program as a crate digging activity. I say that because when you crate dig, you find something, and that thing, it sparks like joy and happiness, and you're super excited and super invested. That's the most important part. You're super invested in getting that work out to the public. And so instead of having these databases, which really don't speak to the humanity of the humans on the database, and have been historically in our industry exploitive of individuals, and, you know, they've done some serious harm, it's better to find something that you like and actually invest in it. Like, I mean, you know, Chevall said, like, we're here, like, minority humans are around, you know, non-Black humans are around. We're never at a loss. You can do a Google search even and find, you know, artists. And you can, but I always tell people, you know, you can listen on Bandcamp, give your artist some money. And you can ask even those artists, reach out to them, like, who are you listening to? Creating dialogue, going back to that socialized idea of art making being something that we do together as humans. But when you crate dig for, you know, your composers that you're going to program for your concert, you're excited about every single piece that is on that program. And it becomes a much more profound, genuine experience that's less white saviory and more like, man, I really just heard all this super cool stuff and I want to share it with you.
Very well said,
I
Hanky.
kind of have I have two thoughts. One is, on one hand, I fully agree with everything you said, and I think curiosity from the people who are in the position of power really matters. And here's a little bit of a research step, is that a lot of people don't, and they're in a lot of control of power, and that is the saddest thing, and that is one step that we really need to take to change. However, on the flip side, we, the people who are able to produce a concert, we are able to create an excitement. how do we transfer it to the people who are less informed and they are just looking at of all the concerts or of all the artistic cultural activities that are out there, where are the money going? Unfortunately, we are living in the capitalist world. Let's face it. How can we change the consumer habits so that if we are programming people of color, we do not have to racial profile them? They can just be allowed to freely express themselves in the cultural, in the social context, in whichever way expression they want. How can we get there? How can we not program a Chinese conductor performing a Chinese piece? Can't they perform anything they want? We are not quite there. And here's like really the big question is, what can we do to get there? And I would really love to hear the panelists' input on that.
I mean, that's a big question. I think in some ways, my feeling is it circles back to what we're saying about perspectives of the people who are in power and just simply not having the perspective to see why that's damaging. I've had experiences just personally in my life where people who are generating press releases and putting together all the stuff to market it, we've done the whole piece together, and I think we've explained that it's, you know, not just about me being Indian, but about so much more in my personal experiences and a communal experience, and there's just so much more to it that's not you know, tagliney or words that can be quickly attached, and we still end up with a product of the press release that is very much about this is a minorities experience. I mean, that was actually the language used, which was kind of surprising in this day and age. But I mean, it was an earnest attempt, but one that ultimately didn't get at that. And my thought was, well, ultimately, no matter how much I'd explained, they just didn't understand my perspective. But if someone who'd had a similar perspective to mine had been in that position of power, we might be facing a very different story. That being said, I really, really appreciate people who come to learn and to know that they have a particular perspective and they're still coming anyway, and they're still coming every day with the attitude of trying to do better, which I think, I mean, I'm not just saying this because they're hosting our panel, although, you know, thank you aside to them, but I think that's the attitude we're seeing from our two hosting organizations, that there is a commitment to doing this every day. Now, as the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker says, there's going to be several steps forward that might even change the makeup of all of these organizations too, that maybe eventually needs to happen. Some of us are calling for it sooner than others, but there's still a commitment to wanting to learn, like you're saying. How do we create that environment? I think it's a partnership on both sides, those of us who are saying it and have been saying it from the start.
I think
yes, please.
I think also, you know, as a person who, you know, full disclosure, I am an award winner of the American Composer Forum Connect program. You know, when I was given that award, it was, you just need to write some music. You can write whatever you want. And then involving artists, you know, the Great Black Music Ensemble, who has had interfacing collaborative experiences with like George Lewis, Roscoe Mitchell, people that are not creating in necessarily the quote unquote standard of Western classical music or even white jazz music. You were given a palette of basically any possibility. And when I was, you know, in, I don't even remember, Minnesota, is that where we're going? I don't know. When I was there in September before there was a pandemic last year, you know, we had a whole week to workshop with these artists. And so they really have created a template of how you can interface with, you know, artists of color, because, you know, the other award winners, you have Ade Coulson, you have Brudresh, as well as you. They are not white people. You know, we all got spice in us. And so because of that, it created this incredibly empowering culture of anything is possible, but also a celebration of not having to code switch to meet some sort of requirements for this money. And I have not had an experience like that. They didn't pay me to say this. They paid me to write music, but they didn't pay me to say this. I haven't had an experience like that before. And I really do, I mean, they've done documenting of this process, and I hope that they, don't take it out and let people see what is possible when you release those strongholds on what you want the artist to produce at the end.
So well said. That freedom is super important. As Amanda just popped into the chat, we're heading into the Q&A section, and just an invitation for you to put your questions in the chats if you have any. But so extremely well said. And Chevall, I mean, we've been discussing the last few things a little bit, particularly maybe in the music world, but I'm sure you've encountered very similar things in your line of work.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we can all reach back to earlier this year as like a touch point where there was a lot of people realized some things after the George Floyd thing, but then we also saw a lot of let me say superficial activism and organizational changes in a lot of places. And this isn't even just like, that's the thing, history repeats itself over and over. I don't like referring to specifically to the Black community. I don't like referring to the George Floyd thing as like this touch point moment, because we've had many of those touch point moments within the past, how many decades? You can probably, pick out at least 100 different cases. I mean, so really in the journalism field, what we're seeing is, specifically with the places I've worked with, is not only looking for sources that are Black or non-Black or, non-white just because they're non-white, but looking for those sources, just to know that we're talking to everybody in our area. We're in Houston, and Houston is by no means, it's a huge area that is wildly diverse. There is no just white population. There is no just Black population. Everybody there in the middle is in this city. So one thing that we're focusing on is just talking to people and making sure that going out of our way to say, okay, I talked to how many people this week? Why are they all white? Or how can they not all be white? Or how can they not all be Black? Or, okay, I was in this section of town. This is normally a Vietnamese part of town. Why did I not talk to any Vietnamese people? It's just like looking at those things and not looking for those people because they are those people, but just getting an accurate representation of what's going on in your city. Because one of the complaints we were getting is that people were like, hey, I live here and you guys do not talk to me. Like, you don't report on my area, you don't report on my issues. And, I feel like what you guys are talking about in terms of music, it's pretty much the same thing. They don't want to be talked to. You guys don't want to, have these programs so that, Black people can play Black music. It's so people can play the music they're supposed to play. You don't want to be tokenized, and a lot of the times when we have these big moments come up where people will, say, okay, so this tragedy happened, let's make some structural changes, it ends up being superficial because it does come down to, okay, we have our quotas met. So really, journalism is kind of going through the same thing, because we've already had a workforce problem where it's overwhelmingly white in a lot of newsrooms. And now that we're starting to hire more people of color, it's getting to the point where they're like, okay, now we have them here, and how can we stop tokenizing them? And that's kind of the issue now, is that, we're getting there, we're getting there. There are people who are working their ways up to those positions, but that's kind of the thing that's kind of funny with all of this, is sometimes it really does take new leadership or somebody who has that knowledge. And I don't want to come off as it saying, like it has to be somebody who isn't white. There are white people who understand these concepts and can implement these things and put other people in positions to implement, things that create a real sense of, expression and equality, that it doesn't just focus on, the color of somebody's skin. So, I feel like what we need is just less tokenization, less, including us in the conversation just for the sake of us including us in the conversation. And then, we get put in the back seat once, a few months pass, and it's like, okay, well, you're here and that's okay. And we might do something for you later, but now if anybody looks at us, okay, well, we have a Black person, so it's okay. We need to move away from that. It needs to be more about including the ideas from everyone.
Yeah, Chevall's point actually just speak to one of the questions in the chat.
If Honky, I'll just share it with the audience then, Honky, if you want to take it over. So I was going to speak to this. The question I was looking at was the one that just came in, which is a great question. Essentially, in the context of a small arts nonprofit, they're deciding whether to change some of the seats to non-white board members. So I'm assuming they have existing white board members and they're going to change, they want to maybe, I don't know if the term is ending or what exactly, or to if they should add more chairs to the table.
I think,
do you have something to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, that is actually one of the very important questions that a lot of the leaders that I've talked to, like, they have the same kind of question, because I'm looking at small orchestras. And I fully echo with what Chevall said. It is not about someone's color or what, it's really what kind of ideas they brought to. As we have already said during the discussion, people of color can just be as white as people who are actually white.
As
it is really
the same, problematic institution.
Right. So it's more about, can you really include communities? Can you really bring in voices from a more diverse perspective? And is this organization creating a space that allows exploration of an alternative identity? Meanwhile, at the same time, I was very focused on the word a smaller organization, yes, which I also recognize the fact that when you have limited resources, money, activities that you can organize, reach, it is at times hard to be I heard one of the stories. There are so many communities out there that we want to engage as an organization, but we can only produce that many things in a year. So how can we create a long-lasting relationship, even though we are not producing an activity with the group? There are organizational challenges that we might not have a very good answer to that yet, but the relationship needs to be cultivated, and it takes years. And it does not necessarily mean, oh, we have an end goal that we need to reach, but it's just a partnership, being able to listen, allow them to participate. It takes years, it takes a lot of effort, but don't try to really just I want to have a milestone that we need to hit, and once we hit the milestone, we are going to wait for another milestone. That's not the way to create a relationship.
Super important answer. And I think that what you stressed there, I'll just highlight one of your points, which is that one, these aren't easy things to answer, and we're all trying to figure it out, but it's about the people, it's about the relationships you have with them. It's not really about your data and your stats. So, data and stats, we've talked about this. That's been one way of approaching this, and it hasn't always been harmful, but there's, definitely indications that it could be harmful now. So to think about what kind of community you're serving and how you maybe want to change that community or broaden that or include different communities in that is I think an important part of what you just said, Honky. So thank you for expressing that so beautifully. We've addressed the other. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
I also, in these consultations that I do with a lot of arts organizations, I also stress that if you're looking to have a partnership with a community, because, some people are not good at serving all the people. Actually, no one is good at serving everyone. You inherently, in some ways, end up excluding some folk, either because you've invited them and they don't want to be, part of the organization or part of the conversation, but you have to let everyone have a chance to be at the table. Once you've done that, you also need to create a relationship that is flexible, because a lot of times, sometimes we get conflict in these attempts to do good, and that has to be said. And so having workable boundaries, workable understandings of what each side is trying to get from the other and what happens if those needs are not met needs to also be said, because a lot of what I see is, yes, these partnerships start, but then it's not really beneficial to one side, but they feel obligated because now they've publicly committed to this organization, and it becomes a contentious situation. So, it just, I guess what I'm trying to say is, yes, we must perform partnerships. And when we make those partnerships, we need to think about the realities of human communication and I don't want to say matchmaking, but it's like compatibility.
Absolutely. And you speak to also we need to tend these relationships. It's not just made and done, but continually be checking in with each other. We've got, I think, one final question that we didn't already address. I'm going to broaden the question a bit since we're coming from different places. So the question is, are you each feeling hopeful or cynical or more cynical about your respective fields, would you say?
Well, I would say, well, journalism's in really a funny spot right now because, you know, there's a lot of, I could go into a few more hours about this, but I'll just mention it. There's a lot of disinformation on the internet. There's a lot of bad community building and ignorance that is kind of like, you know, not just, it's the internet, but, you know, the internet has allowed a lot of different things to fester and kind of, you know, come up and kind of butt journalism in the face and like, you know, kind of look, like put a mirror to it and say, well, I didn't trust you because of this. So this is why I trust this internet thing now. So that also fosters a lot of, you know, non-diverse discussions and a lot of things where, I mean, what is it? Red pilling, where people just believe a bunch of random conservative things that don't make sense. Like Black people commit most of the crime because they're Black people, not because of any socioeconomic struggles or anything like that, or the fact that that statistic is not true. I feel like right now what we're looking at is kind of what I said before, getting more people in the office and then not just putting them in the corner. No, I also think Gary messaged me something really nice. I also think it's great people grow dreadlocks. But yeah, no, I really do think that I have a certain sense of optimism only because I know that there are young journalists right now who are trying to get back to that. And we're using a lot of different platforms, trying to get away from the traditional media of, you know, paper newspapers and really trying to get to the bottom of a lot of issues while not staying neutral to a fault. Because I also feel like that is a problem right now within the journalism industry, is neutrality that, you know, is neutral towards hate. And that's the kind of thing that I feel like we're kind of messing up with. But, you know, to answer your overall question, I feel like we're trying to get there. It's just that there are a lot of other fighting forces along with media distrust and, you know, just people really trying to find their own news that may not be reliable. And, you know, like I said, the internet can foster a lot of those negative opinions. So really it's about gaining back trust. And I feel like the best way to gain back trust is to get people in your community to participate in the media so that those stories are being told. And that is not a color specific thing. It's really just, you know, it's about class. It's about everybody just getting involved in the conversation.
Absolutely. Ask the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker how you're feeling. Maybe it's different each day. I don't know.
I don't hold expectations either way. I'm tend to be a very logical human. So I'm not like overly hopeful. I'm not cynical. I'm somewhere in the, like, in order for us to get things done, we need to do these things. We need to continue to put pressure on leaders. We need to talk about deaccession of positions. And we, you know, there are actions. So for me, I am looking to see who is going to make the tangible changes and actions. But I'm not, I don't like to put my eggs in any basket. So they're not in the basket of hopeful. They're not in the basket of cynical. They're still in the hens. And I'm just waiting to see when they come out. That's basically what it is.
And you, Honky?
I want to respond to the question there first. I think for Cheyenne's question, I don't think any one of us will have a very specific answer just because we don't know your organization well enough. You will know your community and your organization the best. So I think what we care is whether there is an ideological shift and how can the new leadership make that difference. It really whichever way that's the best for you. So I hope that answered the question. I know it's not a satisfying answer, but I think that's my 1%. But back to the concluding question, I'm a pessimist. I'm just going to say it out there. I am not hopeful, but I think things need to be done in order to convince me that I'm wrong. I think that's my way to put it. I think of all of us, I am the closest to the classical music proper. And I am very much confined in the academia, which is another place where there's a very specific culture that is very much colonized, very much white focused. And of course, we are hearing a lot of current efforts. And for those of you who know what is happening in music theory, you know what is happening in music theory discourse right now. I would say, as someone who is skeptical about a lot of things, and as I'm working on my research, I'm just like constantly questioning everything I'm reading. There's a lot of work to be done. And based on what Chevall said, history goes in cycles. And we might go one step forward, we might take 2 steps back sometimes. But how can we not step back? I am not convinced quite yet that we are at the point that this is not happening.
Very well said. Very well said. And there's been more comments in the chat. Yes, you have something to add.
I want to add, so for Cheyenne's specific question, I'm on my iPhone. I can't see all the questions, but I just looked. And for Cheyenne's specific question, you need to basically go find a diversity, equity, inclusion consultant who can speak to your specific thing. Any person that is on this call and involved in an organization should go get a DEI consultant, because they can actually look at what's going on, really give you targeted options for your issues. And they're also going to look at it from an outside perspective. And that's something that I think, if you can find the money, and also there are some that I know that are doing some stuff pro bono, but you really need to have somebody speak to your specific issue. We can have all these discussions and you can go to them and be like, I heard this thing, I heard this thing, but it's like, you don't go to WebMD and self-diagnose yourself and then give yourself medicine. We don't allow you to do that because it's like harmful, like you could kill yourself. You have to go to the actual doctor who has actual experience and an outsider's viewpoint to say, okay, you are having these specific symptoms, and here's what we're going to give you to help you mitigate that illness. So it is super important. Please do your inward work, but don't try to self-diagnose your issues when there are so many people out there who are really good at what they do and can give you help and guidance.
Thank you for that. And I think that can be applied to anyone on the call who's dealing with similar situations. I'm just going to invite Amanda back into our conversation.
Well, I think that that's a perfect point to end on. There are resources out there for continuing this dialogue, and we just, encourage you in all of your organizations to take that actionable next step. So I just want to thank everyone so much for joining us today, and I want to thank our amazing panelists for their insights. We hope that this will be an ongoing conversation, and we're so grateful for their time today. So thank you to Shruthi Rajasekar, the Honorable Elizabeth A. Baker, Han-Ki Cheung, and Chevall Pryce. These types of programs at American Composers Forum and I Care If You Listen are made possible largely in part by people like you who are supporting our programs. So if you feel so inspired and enjoyed our program today, I would encourage you to please visit composersforum.org/donate so that we can keep doing this type of work and keep engaging these wonderful artists and people. So thank you so much. And I think we will wrap up our conversation there.